Welcome to the channel where history meets mind-blowing facts. Here your knowledge will get a powerful boost with every video. From hidden events to legendary figures, we cover it all. In the dense, shadowy depths of the Teutoburg Forest, the might of Rome met a nightmare it never saw coming. The year was 9 AD. At the height of its power, Rome had grown arrogant, believing its legions were invincible. 3 entire Roman legions, 17 June and 19, marched confidently into Germania, led by the experienced but dangerously overconfident governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus. These weren't just any legions. They were the iron backbone of Roman authority in the region, carrying the pride of the empire on their shoulders. But they were walking straight into a trap so perfectly laid that it would go down as one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. The mastermind behind this trap was a man the Romans thought they could trust, Arminius, a Germanic chieftain, raised in Rome, trained in their military tactics, fluent in their language, and even granted Roman citizenship. He had marched with Roman generals, dined with Roman elites, and earned their respect. But all the while, deep inside, Arminius never stopped being a son of Germania. His loyalty was an illusion, and his revenge was years in the making. He saw the Romans not as allies, but as invaders, trampling his homeland under their boots, enslaving his people, and spreading fear under the banner of civilization. And now, he was ready to strike. As Varus led his men through the dense forest, supposedly to suppress a minor local rebellion, he was completely unaware that the terrain was working against him. The forest was thick, muddy, and unfamiliar. The rain poured relentlessly, turning the narrow paths into rivers of muck. The legions, stretched out in a long, vulnerable column, were slowed down by wagons, families of settlers, and animals. It wasn't a march, it was a crawl, and they weren't expecting a battle. Their guard was down. They trusted Arminius, who had ridden ahead, supposedly to gather reinforcements. But what he was really doing was rallying the Germanic tribes, united, not by politics but by a shared hatred for Rome. When the ambush came, it was sudden, brutal, and perfectly executed. Germanic warriors poured out of the trees like ghosts, howling, painted for war, wielding spears, axes, and raw fury. The Romans, trapped in the narrow forest paths, couldn't form proper battle lines. Their shields became useless in the tight quarters, and their discipline, normally their greatest strength, began to crack. Chaos erupted. Officers barked orders that no one could hear over the screams and thunder. Soldiers slipped in the mud, fell over bodies, or vanished into the fog, never to be seen again. Over the next 3 days, the forest became a slaughterhouse. Rain continued to fall, turning the earth red with blood. Roman bodies littered the ground. Those who tried to flee were hunted like animals. Supplies were lost, weapons discarded, morale destroyed. There was no cavalry to save them, no reinforcements, no escape route. Varus, realizing the scale of the disaster, chose suicide over capture. He fell on his sword, a symbol of both Roman honor and Roman defeat. And with his death, the command structure collapsed completely. But Arminius wasn't just killing soldiers. He was sending a message. Survivors were tortured, crucified, or mutilated. Roman standards, the sacred eagles of the legions, were captured, a devastating psychological blow. Heads of Roman officers were nailed to trees. It was not just a military ambush, it was ritual revenge, a declaration that Germania would not be tamed. The forest, once a symbol of raw nature, became a graveyard of Roman arrogance. News of the massacre reached Rome like a thunderclap. The Emperor Augustus, upon hearing it, was said to have wandered his palace in despair, crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was more than just the loss of 20,000 men. It was the shattering of Rome's illusion of control. For the first time in living memory, the empire had been humbled, not by a great army, but by the cunning and fury of so-called barbarians. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a humiliation. And for Rome, humiliation demanded. When the smoke of the Teutoburg disaster finally cleared, Rome was left shaken to its core. But empires don't grieve. They plot. And in the years that followed, the name that began to echo through the marble halls of power was Germanicus. Young, ambitious, and born into the heart of Roman nobility, Germanicus was not just a general, he was a symbol. A living weapon forged from Rome's rage, tasked with one mission: revenge. The kind of revenge that would make Germania bleed. That would turn the memory of Teutoburg into a tale not of shame, but of merciless retribution. Germanicus wasn't just another military leader sent to manage the frontier. He was the nephew of Emperor Tiberius, groomed for greatness, beloved by the legions, and adored by the Roman people. He had the charisma of a natural leader and the steel of a seasoned soldier. His soldiers followed him with fanatical loyalty, not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in him. He inspired something rare in war, hope mixed with fury. When he took command of the Roman forces in Germania, it was more than just a military assignment. It was the beginning of a manhunt. Germanicus wanted Arminius, dead or alive. He didn't want peace, he didn't want diplomacy, he wanted blood. His campaigns began with a storm. He marched deep into hostile territory, cutting through forests, swamps, and the ruins of old Roman outposts like a blade. He knew the land was unforgiving, that the enemy knew every tree and hill. But Germanicus came prepared. He built fortified camps. He launched surprise attacks. He used scouts, spies, and swift cavalry raids. Where Varus had been naive, Germanicus was ruthless. He wasn't there to make alliances. He was there to make an example. Entire Germanic villages were burned to the ground. Resistance fighters were crucified or slaughtered. He took hostages, destroyed supply lines, and shattered tribal unity with the precision of a surgeon and the cruelty of a wolf. But his most powerful victory wasn't just in bloodshed. It was in symbolism. In a moment that electrified his men and horrified his enemies, Germanicus returned to the cursed site of the Teutoburg massacre. The forest still held the bones of thousands of fallen Romans, untouched, scattered like forgotten relics. Spears still jutted from the trees, skulls still grinned from stakes. It was a haunted graveyard of Roman failure. But Germanicus didn't flinch. He ordered his soldiers to collect the bones, to give the dead a proper burial, to reclaim not just the remains but the honor of Rome. It was a chilling ritual, a silent vow carved into the soil with sweat, tears, and iron. And then he went hunting. Arminius, now a legend among his people, was waiting. He knew Germanicus wasn't Varus. This wasn't going to be another easy ambush. But even Arminius couldn't have expected the full force of Germanicus's fury. Battles erupted like thunderclaps. The Roman legions, reinvigorated and hungry for payback, cut down Germanic warriors with brutal efficiency. At the Battle of Viso, Germanicus unleashed a devastating attack that nearly broke Arminius's forces completely. The Germanic tribes were fragmented, uncoordinated, and outmatched. The Romans moved like a machine, disciplined, relentless, and merciless. Still, Arminius was a survivor. Wounded, bloodied, and driven, he slipped through the chaos, refusing to be captured. He fought not just for himself, but for every tribe that feared Roman chains. Germanicus pursued him like a phantom, always one step behind, always just out of reach. But the damage was done. Germanicus didn't need to capture Arminius to win. He had already shattered his coalition, torched his strongholds, and sent a message louder than any trumpet: Rome remembers, and Rome retaliates. But even as Germanicus pressed forward, his victories stirred unease back in Rome. The Emperor Tiberius, watching from afar, began to worry. Germanicus was becoming too popular, too powerful. His campaigns were brilliant but expensive, and the more he won, the more he outshined the emperor himself. Tiberius, ever the paranoid ruler, feared what a triumphant Germanicus might become: a rival, a hero of the people with legions at his back. So with a stroke of political caution, he ordered Germanicus to halt his campaign and return to Rome. It was a bitter command. Germanicus had Germania on its knees. He wasn't finished. He had pushed farther into the wilds than any Roman since Julius Caesar. The taste of complete victory was within reach. But he obeyed. That was the Roman way. Duty before ambition. He withdrew his legions, leaving a trail of fire and fear behind him. The revenge wasn't complete, but it was undeniable. Germanicus had turned the tide. He had turned Rome's deepest shame into a tale of ferocious vengeance. As Germanicus withdrew his legions into the heart of Germania, what followed was not a conventional war. It was a storm of calculated fury. This was no longer about reclaiming territory or winning hearts. It was about inflicting unforgettable pain. The Roman Empire, humiliated once in the Teutoburg Forest, now unleashed a campaign that would forever stain the soil of Germania with Roman vengeance. The forest that once whispered of ambush now screamed with the clash of steel and the cries of the dying. Villages didn't just fall, they vanished. Flames devoured wooden homes, and the smoke curled into the sky like black serpents, announcing to the gods that the blood price was being paid. Germanicus turned every legionnaire into a weapon of wrath. Every Roman sword carried the memory of the legions lost. The soldiers didn't need speeches. They had the ghosts of their brothers beside them. They moved with deadly coordination, wiping out settlements one after another. The Germanic people had never seen such relentless warfare. Men were cut down in fields trying to defend their homes. Women and children fled into the woods only to be dragged back as prisoners. Those who resisted were crucified or impaled along roadsides as a brutal warning. Rome does not forgive. The rivers ran dark with blood, and the Roman eagle soared above lands once thought untamable. Germanicus didn't stop at military dominance. He struck at the soul of the enemy. Sacred groves were desecrated, altars destroyed, idols smashed. The spiritual heart of Germania was torn apart. In Roman eyes, this wasn't just war. It was divine justice. Entire tribes were broken, leaders executed, their names wiped from history. The brutality wasn't reckless, it was intentional. Germanicus wanted the Germanic tribes to remember Rome, not as an invader, but as an unstoppable force of nature, one that could flood the land in fire and vanish before dawn. And yet, even in the carnage, he was a master of psychological warfare. In a move as chilling as it was brilliant, Germanicus retrieved the lost legionary standards, those sacred eagles lost in the Teutoburg disaster. These weren't just symbols. They were the soul of each legion. Their recovery wasn't just a victory, it was resurrection. The legionnaires erupted in fury and pride as the banners were raised high once more, their lost honor finally reclaimed. The impact on morale was electric. The soldiers believed they were avenging not just the fallen, but the empire itself. But Germanicus was far from finished. He knew that terror alone wouldn't crush resistance. He needed to keep the enemy disoriented. He divided his forces into rapid strike teams, launching attacks across vast stretches of territory, giving the Germanic tribes no time to regroup. Roman ships traveled down rivers, supplying distant outposts, while cavalry units ravaged the countryside. Nowhere was safe. One moment a village was silent under moonlight, and the next, flames would consume it. Roman engineers cut roads into impossible terrain, building fortresses as fast as they destroyed homes. The Germans were being hunted in their own homeland, stalked by an enemy who fought with a mix of precision, patience, and savagery. Germanicus didn't just rely on brute force. He used prisoners as sources of intelligence, often torturing them for information or forcing them to march ahead of the legions as human shields. He turned former allies of Arminius against each other, spreading betrayal like a disease. Tribes who had once stood side by side began to fracture under fear and suspicion. Some surrendered just to survive, while others, too proud to bow, were completely eradicated. In every strategy, Germanicus showed the cold, calculating genius of a man born to conquer. Meanwhile, Arminius, once the hero of the forest, found himself playing defense. His coalition was splintering. His resources were stretched thin. He was no longer fighting the Rome of Varus, slow and arrogant. He was facing the wrath of a Rome that had tasted defeat and wanted revenge with every breath. Arminius fought valiantly, ambushing supply lines, harassing the rear guard, trying to lure Germanicus into traps. But the momentum was gone. On the bow, Romans had adapted. They weren't falling for old tricks. Germanicus was always one step ahead, anticipating ambushes, fortifying camps, and retaliating with overwhelming force. At the Battle of the Weser River, the Roman war machine clashed. With Germanic forces in a decisive showdown, the Roman legions formed impenetrable ranks while Germanic warriors charged with fury and desperation. But it wasn't enough. Arrows rained down like a storm. Roman discipline held firm. The battlefield became a butcher's ground. Germanic fighters were mowed down by coordinated volleys, cavalry charges, and iron discipline. The Romans didn't just win, they dominated. They turned the battlefield into a demonstration of Roman superiority. Though Germanicus returned to Rome hailed as a hero, the blood-soaked soil of Germania told a story far from finished. Arminius was still alive, scarred but unbroken. The Germanic tribes, while shattered, were not erased. Rome had brought hell upon the forests, yet it could not chain the land. And so, Germanicus's campaigns ended not with a final conquest, but with a thunderous warning that echoed through time: defy Rome, and you will pay with everything. Back in the empire, Germanicus was celebrated with triumphs, parades, and honors. He had recovered the lost eagles, avenged the disgrace of Teutoburg, and restored the confidence of a shaken Rome. Statues were raised. Songs were sung. The Senate bowed to his accomplishments. But despite all his victories, there was an unease in the air. His fame grew too fast, his popularity among the legions too powerful, and in the shadows of the imperial court, envy took root. Emperor Tiberius, watching closely, began to fear that Germanicus's legend would eclipse his own rule. In a calculated move, Germanicus was sent east, far from Rome, far from Germania, far from the legions who worshipped him. There, under suspicious circumstances, he fell ill and died. Many believed he was poisoned, a victim of palace intrigue. Rome had created a hero, but heroes often become threats. And so Germanicus passed into history, not as an emperor, but as a symbol of what Rome could become when pushed beyond its limits, a vengeful, relentless force of nature. Meanwhile, the fate of Arminius unraveled. Once hailed as the liberator of Germania, he too fell victim to power struggles. He was assassinated by members of his own tribe, betrayed by the very people he fought to protect. His dream of a united Germania crumbled, not under Roman swords, but under the weight of tribal rivalries and internal jealousy. He had defeated an empire once, but in the end, he couldn't conquer his own people. And so both champions of the bloodiest conflict between Rome and Germania met tragic ends, not on the battlefield, but in the aftermath of their triumphs. Their legacies, however, lived on. Germanicus's campaigns marked the final time Rome would try to conquer Germania. After him, the empire shifted to fortifying its borders rather than expanding them. The Rhine River became the edge of Roman ambition. Beyond it lay a land forever remembered for its defiance, its brutality, and its ability to humble even the greatest empire the world had ever known. The revenge Rome unleashed was terrifying, absolute and unforgettable. But it wasn't total. Germania remained free, unconquered, and wild. The price for the humiliation at Teutoburg was paid with rivers of blood, yet Rome never fully regained what it had lost, the illusion of invincibility. And perhaps that's the real lesson of this story, that even the strongest empires bleed, that even the most disciplined armies can fall, and that revenge, no matter how brutal, always comes at a cost. History remembers this campaign not just as a clash of armies, but as a clash of wills. Rome, the eternal empire, driven by glory and vengeance. Germania, the defiant land, fighting for freedom with tooth and claw. Their war left scars not only in the forest, but in the hearts of those who lived to remember it. And those scars still whisper through time, warning future powers that every conquest breeds resistance and every humiliation, if left unanswered, demands a reckoning. If you found this story as gripping as we did, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more spine-chilling tales from history's darkest corners. The ancient world was a brutal place, and we're here to uncover every blood-soaked secret. This is just the beginning.